Hi, I'm John Schneider with Mass Insight Education and Research, and I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Pia Durkin, who's author of a new book, The Superintendent's Work with Principals Improving Instruction and Achieving Results. Dr. Durkin is currently a leadership consultant and executive coach for senior school leaders. And I first got to know Dr. Durkin when she served as the superintendent of the New Bedford Public Schools. The New Bedford school system has been a longtime partner with Mass Insight. Pia, welcome. It's great to talk to you about your new book.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here, John.
Thanks. So why don't we start? Just tell us a little bit about why you wrote the book and why the book may be particularly relevant now for district and school leaders.
It's a great question to start off. I wrote the book for a couple of reasons, primarily that I had the benefit of serving with some great leaders. And when I began to hire leaders, it became increasingly more challenging to figure out what is that essence of leadership that is going to make a difference with kids. And largely, as you know, superintendents and principals, it's largely the difference you're going to be making with adults. And though all of us can talk about, I know a great leader when I see it, and I know when I have one, how can we articulate what are the elements that makes an effective leader and someone who can grow to be that leader? So I began to take a lot of notes as when I was superintendent, and I was superintendent in 2 districts, and started to capture the people who largely had reinvented themselves to become better leaders. Yes, I like to say I found some great people who right off the bat were able to demonstrate good leadership, but they were continuous learners. But what I was most proud of were those individuals who were not so great when we first started working together. And it wasn't because of me as their superintendent. It was because they made the commitment to change what they were doing to help others become better at what they could do. And that is the essence of the story of the book, because in the book, I feature about a dozen principals, administrators who demonstrated that change in their practice and who are still doing it today. And for that, that's what sustainability is about. It's not about one superintendent or one principal. It's about how we change others to make that difference with kids.
You know, one thing that I noticed in the book as I read it, and I think it's part of your leadership style and part of what you value as a leader, is a real commitment to excellence and equity throughout. That the reason why this relationship between superintendent and principal is important is because the important value of excellence and equity in our schools. This is how we achieve educational and excellence and equity. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that plays out in the book?
Well, John, you captured it well. I've been an urban educator for the last 40 years. I cut my teeth in New York City. I then moved up to Providence, Boston, and had the great privilege of serving in Attleboro and New Bedford. And urban education is at our core. Mass Insight, that's your philosophy in terms of what you do.
Changing lives and changing schools is what we talk about.
Absolutely. And changing the adults in those schools to be able to change those children's lives.
Right.
So excellence and equity is very much part of my core values. And it's one of the things I talk about in the chapter on hiring and evaluating principals. But when you look at having both is so critical for our kids. Excellence without equity perpetuates privilege. And that means some kids get great stuff, and some kids, unless they're lucky or randomly chosen or have a very loud advocate, will not get that great stuff. And then equity without excellence sort of sets up a system for mediocrity, where we all try to achieve something, but nobody is really achieving at the highest levels, or what I call that ceiling of aspirations that really cuts into kids' dreams and hopes. So the people that I talk about in the book, and the reason for the book, is to how do you find both? And how do you assess that and look at the indicators along the way that we're breeding those same values into not only leaders, but into all the educators we touch, and then help a community believe in it, that we can be both excellent and be fair to all children, because some children need more than others. And sometimes that's a hard concept for people to understand,
Right.
that some may need more than others simply because that's where they start.
Uh, this is not an academic book per se. It's really a practical kind of hands-on guide to the relationship between superintendents and principals and the leadership skills that are important. How do you see this book being used, uh, as you begin to share it with others?
I'm really glad that you stated it's not a research book, and it definitely is not a memoir. It's really what I like to consider a go-to resource book. It may not even be read cover to cover.
Right.
It really is about pulling it off the shelf and looking at a particular chapter that could help you look through a model of how to best deal with it. So when we look at possibly dealing with teams, and if anything, this pandemic has brought out how lonely the job of a superintendent is, and how lonely the job of a principal is. And how do you really build a team, particularly in these situations, that makes us accountable to each other, setting up some communication guidelines that are going to work? Because, as you well know, those are some of the issues when we have a team that may say one thing and do another, or not feel comfortable to share with their superintendent, we're really screwing up here, or we're not doing as well. We're not just checking the boxes, but we're really not reaching all kids, or we're really worried about this group of parents who are not satisfied with what we're doing. So that relationship issue is a critical one, in terms of really figuring out what parts of the book, what are the entry points for the book? Am I struggling with time? I happen to believe very strongly that to lead the work is you have to know the work, and you can't know it if I'm not working with you side by side. Maybe not every day, but being in schools and understanding your world as a principal, as well as helping central office understand that. We know there's a natural tension between central office and principals. I've never worked in a district where there wasn't there. How do we build that bridge to understand that our primary job is to work for principals and to work for schools? We don't exist without that. So in this type of time where there's so much uncertainty, so much anxiety, I've been working with people on over communicating, of really setting up systems so that there be no surprises, that tell me the truth, and we're going to have to pivot to make some hard decisions at times with very little data, but we're dealing with the lives and safety of children and adults.
There's
And
there's an example that I want to unpack a little bit more in the book. It's in the chapter about will and skill, and I want to talk about the concept of will and skill in a moment. But you're talking about the uh, uh, using kind of your experience in New Bedford, Mass, as a case study. It was a school district that the state was watching really closely. And you were brought in to lead a turnaround effort in New Bedford. And you talk about the improvements that took place over a 6 or 7 year period in the school district. And you write, quote, "The story behind this data and these schools has one common trend in that the principals changed their practice to relentlessly focus on improving the quality of instruction and supports in every classroom." What and then goes on a little further, what did change was what the principals did with the educators they led and what teachers then did with their students. This involved leaders having a laser like focus on instruction using specific plans and key strategies and adapting teaching and learning delivery systems that kept front and center the needs of students. I think that's a really important lesson in terms of the important role of principals leading a change in a school, really focusing on the needs of students. Um, Tell me a little bit more about why that's important and how you guys and the efforts that you did in New Bedford to implement such a vision.
Well, we started off with what everybody knows, that second to the first most important thing is the teacher in the classroom. That's what raises achievement. The second most important thing that has been shown by research over and over again is the principal. And the principal having an instructional leadership lens is absolutely critical. And I, like most superintendents, had a range of principals. And I knew I couldn't touch 13,000 kids. I wanted to, tried to over the period I was there, or 1,500 staff members, but I could touch 25 principals. And those principals had all levels of what we'd consider instructional leadership capacity. Some were very good managers. They were on an island, they ran great schools, and they had zero results or very little results and very little progress. Some had real issues with being in classrooms or working with staff. And if we look at what we need to help and happen in classrooms, it's to help teachers become more effective. So the first step was to really analyze, how are we spending our time? And how do we at the central office take away some of those things and be able to help people develop that will and skill to be in classrooms and support them to be able to become better instructional leaders. And, you know, one of the things that was great about New Bedford was people were worried about going into classrooms and having such a presence. After a while, it became second nature.
Mm-hmm.
And the data supports that the more you're in classrooms, teachers are more relaxed, more comfortable, rather than 2-3 times a year when John comes in and I have to do this super lesson and I get evaluated by it. We did a number of short 15, 20-minute lessons to be able to look at and capture, how are you being able to engage kids? How are you starting them off? Are they able to be able to tell you why they're learning what they're learning? Where are we getting stuck? Are we having trouble with differentiation? Are we stuck with some kids? Are we evaluating how we're teaching? So we took a very simple model of learning about instruction, executing it, and then adapting it. And as simple as that sounds, it was very complex because people come in at different learning levels. People execute differently. How many times have we seen a great plan? And in my career, I had to write a lot of turnaround plans, but they were only as good as they affected the classroom. Because you can have great plans, great systems, but if it's not affecting progress in the classroom, you're really not turning around a district.
Yeah, that to me, that's really the big challenge when we talk about school turnaround, when we talk about school improvement. It's what is going on in that classroom, and how is that student being supported? How is that teacher being supported? You talk about building results focused teams as being crucial, and can you expand on that a little bit? What do you mean by a results focused team? What does that look like? How do you build it?
Sure. I do want to comment in what you just said, is the fact that the kids in New Bedford didn't change, okay? And the book is largely
Now,
about—
take a moment. Tell us about New Bedford. What kind of community is it? You know, what kind of students were you working with? It's a great city. I love New Bedford. It's a gateway city.
It's
Has
not
an
only a great city,
amazing
it's a
history.
terrific community that I embraced, lived there, and loved the people I worked with, as well as the people who led and were part of that community. And it's still there and doing some good work as it continues, which is what it's all about. But essentially, it's a community of 13,000 students in the school district, 25 schools. About 80% are free and reduced lunch. 80% of, a little bit more than 80%, comes from the state in terms of funding. It grapples, as every gateway city, in terms of how do we manage all the needs of the city. It's Essentially, when I entered and took the job, I very much wanted to be in an urban district, and fortunately got the job, and it was one of the lowest performing districts in the state. And for years it had been that way. So the kids hadn't changed. And largely, I will say, even though I had certain turnaround authority, the adults didn't change, except at the high school, which I did use the authority I had to have people reapply for their jobs. Many came back, many decided to leave because the high school was in a very bad shape at that time and is now doing quite well, staying the course, as we say, in terms of dropout rates and graduation rates, and better than they've done in the last 10 years. Managed by and led by a terrific headmaster who has been in the community for many years, Bernadette Coelho. So why I say that is that when you look at teams, the concept of team was really not understood in New Bedford. It was, if I'm doing okay, I'm gonna keep myself working, and my teaching is a solo act, or my school is okay, I'm on an island. And a lot was done through who you knew. So if you were kind of like good with the HR department, maybe you'd get the 5 or 6 candidates who were going to be able to teach well. If not, maybe you were told to go look in a box and figure out who you'd want to hire. So I say that was in the beginning. I do believe when you talk about results-focused teams, you need to be able to look at less process and more productivity. And I do talk about in the book what I consider problematic behaviors of teams. The central office was very in their silos. There was finance, which was, the answer was no to anything you wanted to do. HR was not really recruiting or attracting, you could imagine at a difficult district, good candidates, and we weren't retaining them. And yes, there is always a challenge in urban districts. New Bedford is not alone in that. But when you talk about results-focused teams, it's not just following protocols. It's showing up and looking at how that team operates and pulling out what is making that team effective and this team not. Is there more of a lack of urgency? Well, we're doing okay. We've got 60% of the kids at proficiency, so that's okay. But you know, the reason why we're not really seeing that much is because the EL kids, the English learner kids, we just got so many of them. Well, yeah, we do. And how do we now adapt to be able to work with those kids? What are our structures and processes that are showing that? So part of building a result-focused team is really looking at internal accountability. We talk a lot in this state about accountability, and we have pretty high standards for accountability. But my accountability as a team member is related to you, John, as another team member. And I like to use the term reciprocal accountability, that we are going to have to see your work is related to my work. If we decide on working on something in 3rd grade, we've got to communicate with that 4th grade team. And this is one of the challenges as we come back from this pandemic. Where did we leave off? Because we know we can't start off back where we left on March 13th. We need to be able to look at those power standards, as the State Department has definitely promoted, and rightly so, as to what our kids need to learn to help them advance as quickly as we can. Because otherwise we're going to be further behind, particularly for young kids.
Here, we've got time for one more question, although I have many, and I hope we're able to have another discussion down the road about your book, The Superintendent's Work with Principals, Improving Instruction and Achieving Results. And we'll have information on our website about how you can order that book. It's published by Research for Better Teaching. It's part of their Skillful Leaders series, and we'll have some information about how you can order the book. Again, it is a really thoughtful guide to the relationship between the superintendent and their work with principals, and the important role of principals in working with their schools to get the results that all of us are looking for, especially as we talk about issues of excellence and equity. But I wanted to just ask you, in our remaining moments, how does this book relate And you have to be really quick with this answer. With the pandemic that we're now facing, and the situation in the fall, what's one or two lessons from this book about preparing for the opening of schools in August and September?
Well, the book is built on the will and skill framework. Will meaning I've got to have the persistence, the resilience, and the drive to be able to learn and do the best I can for the people and kids I serve. And skill is being able to figure out what I need to know and also what I don't know and making that difference. I think one of the most important issues is about teams, as we just talked about. It's also setting up some non-negotiables. So being able to work with central office and principals to say, what are we going to agree to? No surprises. How do we be able to keep information flowing? How do we be able to support each other that we're one team? Because nothing unnerves families in the community more when there are disparate teams. And misinformation, as you know, with this pandemic, can fly like wildfire. The other piece is setting up priorities. We need to chunk out this school year. We need to figure out, what are we doing between now and October 15th? We've got to figure out safety. We got to look at connecting, why some kids were connected and some not, and how do we shore them up to make sure they stay connected when we may have to go offline or do a hybrid. And we need to also look at a teaching and learning, and how do we maximize not going back to March, but really pushing forward for our kids to accelerate. The other piece is to plan ahead. There is probably going to happen that we may have to shut down, even if it's for a week, might be for a few days. What's the criteria for that? And can we plan now to anticipate what our kids would be doing during that time? I know for a fact districts raced that week in March to get computers out, to get books out. We want to try to anticipate what that might look like now, knowing what we have. And visibility and accessibility. Zoom has become our byproduct, or how we do this. I'm working with superintendents. The cafeteria workers want to see your face. The bus drivers do. Communities do ongoing messaging. It could be as short as a 5-minute thing.
A little video, sure. Yep.
Doing well. We're doing okay. We're hanging in there, and remind people, though we've never gone through this pandemic, that we have been through tough times.
Yes, right. Absolutely.
And we've done it.
Right. Pia, thank you. As always, I love talking to you about your experiences, about education, your commitment to teachers and to students and families. Thank you for taking some time to talk about your book.
Thank you so much. It was a true pleasure.